have decided, Professor Susser, Asher Susser. Asher is here. Please stand, Asher, if you would be so much. Asher is the Andrea and David Stein Professor of Modern Israel Studies here at the U of A. And this symposium was really his idea. I just filled out the paperwork. And he came up with a great theme, Israel's place in the changing Middle East. As we were talking about it, we realized there is a regional, a global type of component to this that we explored the last 2 days, and there's a domestic component. We will next year turn in a similar symposium to Israel's changing society and politics. That will be the theme for next year. So you can applaud that. That's a good idea. Right? This is part, as I mentioned earlier, part of a process of bringing Israel studies front and center here on campus and in the university. So that's the next thing to look forward to. And if you're here, you'll certainly know all about that one. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Tonight's lecture, in addition to being part of the symposium, is part of the Shale and Louis Poses Memorial Lectureship Series that we have on Monday evenings. This is the first time in, I think, next year, 20 years of this lectureship series. And first time we've held it in this context, around a dinner like this. And we have, so this is a unique event, you could say, and we have a similarly unique speaker. Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich was Israel's ambassador to the United States from 1993 to 1996. He is the founding president of the Israel Institute in Washington, D.C. And in that regard, we all owe him, and I more than anyone else, great thanks for his generous support. He is also the Distinguished Global Professor at New York University, a Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's been a visiting professor both at Cornell and Harvard. He is a member of the American Philosophical Society, a foreign member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a member of the Trilateral Commission. He is the Ettinger Professor Emeritus of Contemporary History of the Middle East at Tel Aviv University. His service to Tel Aviv University is, quite frankly, remarkable. All the way through. He served as chair of the Department of Middle East Studies, director of the Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies, dean of humanities, rector, we would call provost, the chief academic officer of the university. And if all that weren't enough, from 1999 to 2007, he was president of Tel Aviv University. He has also had a distinguished diplomatic career. He was, as I mentioned, Israel's ambassador to the United States from 1993 to 96. If that wasn't a big enough job, he also served as Israel's chief negotiator with the Syrians from 1992 to 1996. He has, for many years, played an important role and had a formative impact on American-Israeli relations. He has been at the table when some of the most significant events in modern Israeli history have taken place. He has, for many years, been a leader in that regard. He's the world's foremost authority on Syria, having written several books related to that. Today, Syria is once again the focal point of regional and international concern. The title of his lecture this evening is The Struggle for Syria Revisited. I am very pleased to welcome, for the 6th time to Tucson, Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich. Ambassador.
Thank you, Ed, for this very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's always a pleasure to come back to Tucson, visit my close friends Alice and Paul Baker, see Don Diamond, spend time with Ed and with the other friends that I have collected here over the years. Am I being heard well at the end? Well, thank you. my neighbor at the table asked me, so what is your prediction about Syria going to be tonight as you address us? So this is the first and the last light-hearted comment I'm going to make tonight because our subject is somber. You know, in the British Foreign Office, there is a tradition that every 3 months, the ambassador, the head of a diplomatic mission in the British Foreign Service, sends a quarterly report to the Foreign Office in which he or she sum up the events of the quarter and end with a predictive paragraph. So in January 1954, the British ambassador in Damascus was writing the quarterly report for the last quarter of 1953. At that time, Syria was governed by a military dictator whose name was Adib Shishakli. And the British ambassador had a very sanguine view of Shishakli and his prospects. So in his predictive paragraph, he was a bit carried away and ended it by saying that unless he commits suicide, Shishakli is here to stay. 10 days later, Shishakli was toppled in a military coup. And everybody in the Foreign Office were holding their breath, waiting for the ambassador's first telegram. It came, and it became a classic in the annals of the British Foreign Office, because it opened with the following sentence: a close scrutiny of the events that have unfolded in Damascus during the last few days would inevitably lead one to the conclusion that Shishakli committed a political suicide. So, in other words, very difficult and very dangerous to make predictions about Syria, predictions in general, but about Syria in particular. So how is it that Syria became such a focal point of regional and international politics? And why the title that we chose for my presentation, The Struggle for Syria Revisited? Well, The Struggle for Syria 1945-1958 is the title of a classic book written by a British journalist and author called Patrick Seal, who passed away not too long ago, and was a man who knew Syria very well. And the theme of his book about the first 13 years of Syrian independence was that Syria was a very weak, very fragile country, that instead of being an actor in the politics of the Middle East, it became an object in Middle Eastern politics. Everybody, regional actors and international actors, had their fingers or hands in Syrian politics. And the result of these turbulent 13 years was the collapse of Syria as an independent state, and Syria merged itself into a union with Egypt that was called the United Arab Republic, lasted for 3.5 years, from February 58 to September 61. So, in a way, what we are seeing now is that, to begin with, this is not the first time that Syria is collapsing. It had already collapsed as a state in 1958, and it took 3.5 years of life under Egyptian domination for the Syrians to discover that they were Syrians, that they were different from the Egyptians, that they did not want to be dominated by the Egyptians, and they broke away, re-established a very fragile, independent Syrian republic. Was very fragile for 9 years, until a man called Hafez Assad took power in Syria in November 1970, ruled it for 30 years, from 1970 to 2000, when he passed away. And he's the man who built the modern Syrian state and turned it actually not only into a fairly strong state, but into a regional actor, a country that was not a major international actor, but he himself became an important international figure. He played successfully between the United States and the Soviet Union. He met with American presidents. He charmed many of them. If you look at the memoirs of Jimmy Carter, Henry Kissinger, Jim Baker, Bill Clinton, you will discover that they all, in a way, developed an admiration for this man who was a combination of a brutal dictator who could kill maybe 30,000 of his own people in a city called Hama in 1982, but had a wry sense of humor, a total recall, a very smart man, a man who was very difficult to negotiate with, but once he made a deal, he kept it. An intriguing figure, and he built a strong Syria, and he then left it to his son, Bashar, the current president of Syria. Bashar, I should say, and that's not an anecdote, but an important fact, was not the original heir apparent. His brother Basil was the heir apparent. Basil was killed in a car accident, and Bashar was an ophthalmologist studying in London, was called back by the father and was told that as of tomorrow you are a lieutenant colonel in the Syrian army and the heir apparent. And clearly Bashar does not have the gifts that his father had and his brother had, and his failures as a man and as a leader are an important part of the explanation as to why Syria is today where it is today. Now, so we have again a struggle for Syria. How did it develop? I mentioned Hafiz al-Assad, I mentioned Bashar al-Assad. I should now mention the fact that both father and son come from a sectarian minority, the Alawites. The Alawites are an offshoot of Shia Islam. Very broadly speaking, we have two major denominations in Islam, Sunnah and Shia, not to be compared with Catholic and Protestants, but as a superficial comparison for the two large denominations, maybe we can use that comparison. On the whole, the Sunnah have been through the ages the dominant denomination, and the Shia were always the minority, felt a sense of persecution. The only country in which the Shia had full control for several centuries by now is Iran. In other countries, they have either been a minority or a dominated majority. And out of the Shia, they developed sects. One of them is the Alawite sect. It's a sect that has Islamic elements, Christian elements, pagan elements, and strict Muslims, like the Saudi Arabian Wahhabis and other strict Muslims, do not recognize the Alawites as proper Muslims. So the Alawites, who are 12% of the population of Syria, through a complex process that we don't have the time to go through, but through their influence in the Syrian army and in the party that became the dominant party in Syria called the Ba'ath Party. Ba'ath in Arabic means Renaissance. So the Ba'ath Party is the party of Arab Renaissance. Their combined presence in the party and in the army made them dominant when the party seized power in 1963 through a military coup. And once they found themselves in power, they found themselves on the back of a tiger. They knew and they know that it's dangerous for a minority to rule a majority. But there they are, and therefore they became determined to stay in power. And they developed a very elaborate system of being in control. For instance, they generated a very large number of army officers, and the Syrian army has been riddled with Alawites. There were also many Sunnis, many Sunni officers, but almost every Sunni officer would be either under or over an Alawite officer. Same thing, and even more so in the security services. And the fact is that for almost 50 years now, since 1963, they've been able to maintain that position at the resentment of the Sunni majority, because the Sunnis don't accept them as legitimate Muslims, and the first article in the Syrian constitution stipulates that the president of Syria should be a Muslim. And in the eyes of the Muslims, they are not governed by a Muslim president. So here is one very important element of restlessness, and I've already mentioned the massacre that the father, Hafiz al-Assad, perpetrated in 1982. And of course, if you add to this the almost 300,000 killed in this civil war, there is a blood account between the Alawite minority and the Sunni majority. And the Alawites are afraid, and not without reason, that should the war be decided and should the Sunnis win the war, there would be a massacre. So here is one very important element in the picture. Second has to do with the very nature of the Syrian state. And in this connection, I'd like to add another element, the Iraqi state. And the point I would like to make very strongly is that you cannot, in fact, speak just about the Syrian crisis. The Syrian crisis cannot be separated from the Iraqi crisis. And let me demonstrate it with a very clear, one very important fact. Today, of course, we are all obsessed with the idea and with the activity of the organization, the nefarious organization known as the Islamic State. The Islamic State is an Iraqi organization originally. It is a very strange hybrid of two elements. The people who used to be the army officers, the police officers, the security officers in Saddam Hussein's army, and a branch of al-Qaeda. In 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq and toppled the regime of Saddam, it made one, or maybe more than one, capital mistake. Instead of just decapitating the regime of Saddam Hussein, it dismantled the whole regime, and it sent home close to 100,000 people who used to be army officers, police officers, security officers, all of them trained and angry. They were sent home. And in 2003, after 4 centuries of Sunni domination in Iraq by a Sunni minority of 20% Arab Sunnis, power shifted to the Arab Shia in Iraq. So the Sunnis have felt since 2003 dispossessed, and they had 100,000 angry men who first participated in the anti-American insurrection that you all know about, and then joined forces with a branch of al-Qaeda to form this organization called Islamic State. The first full name is called ISIS, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Why Syria? Because once the Syrian civil war broke out, and we'll talk about it in a minute, they decided to join the Syrian rebellion, which after all was the rebellion of Sunni Arabs against the Shia sect. And it was there that they had their first successes, where they acquired fame and reputation and training and power. And then they went back into Iraq, and we all remember, suddenly, in a very surprising way, captured Mosul, threatened to capture Baghdad, and today they dominate a very large swath of land on both sides of the non-existent boundary between Iraq and Syria. They have not declared a state. They have what they call an Islamic caliphate, but it is a de facto state with a capital in Raqqa, as you know. And in that regard, Iraq and Syria cannot be separated. They can also not be separated for another reason, which is the Kurdish minority. The Kurds are a people of about 20 million. They speak a language that is close to Persian. They are not Arabs. They are Sunnis. And in the partition of the Middle East at the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was dismembered, they found themselves divided among 4 states: Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. And of course, these 4 states have always had a common interest to prevent the Kurds from uniting and forming a Kurdish state. Look at it for one moment from Turkey's point of view. Turkey, which is considered a powerful Middle Eastern state, has a Kurdish minority of 20%. And Erdogan is terrified by the idea that there would be a Kurdish state, let's say in Iraq or in Syria, because he is afraid that his own Kurds would then gravitate towards the independent Kurdish state, and the future of the Turkish state would be in question. So we are actually looking at a domino effect situation in the Middle East, where the unraveling of one country or the changes in one country are affecting another country. So in Iraq and Syria, there are Kurdish minorities. The Kurds are in Iraq, a large minority, 20% of the population. They're in the north of the country, and since 2003, they have enjoyed virtual independence. They don't declare independence, they don't declare statehood, they don't declare sovereignty, because they know that the Turks will invade. So they enjoy all the trappings of independence. They're actually doing very well economically because oil is in their territory. It flows through Turkey. There is nice income. And there is a de facto independence, but it's not being declared. There's a smaller Kurdish minority in Syria. Syria is a population of about 22 million, or had a population of 22 million. About 10% are Kurds, let's say about 2 million. They are in the northeast of the country, and since the civil war that broke out in 2011, they also have a degree of autonomy and virtual independence. And the fates of the Kurds in Iraq and the Kurds in Syria are of course connected. And you may remember just a few months ago there was fierce fighting in a Kurdish town on the Turkish border called Kobani. That could have been decided by Turkish intervention. The Turks did not intervene because they did not want the Kurds in Syria to be too autonomous. So the Kurds is another element that unites the fates of Iraq and Syria. Furthermore, let me spend a couple of minutes talking about the very foundations of the Arab state system. Sometimes if you read a scholarly article or you read in one of the most serious papers, people refer to what has been happening in the Middle East since 2011 as the end of Sykes-Picot. What is Sykes-Picot? Sykes-Picot is an agreement made in May 1916 between a British diplomat and a French diplomat for the partition of the Arab territories of the Ottoman Turkish Empire after World War I, in the event of Turkey's defeat in the war, which happened. And it was not implemented literally, but was the basis for the new order, the system of states that was established in the Middle East after World War I. This is how Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, mandatory Palestine, Jordan were created, more or less on the basis of the understandings reached between Sykes and Picot. And when people look at the unraveling of these states today, they speak about the end of Sykes-Picot. But what did Sykes-Picot or their superiors actually achieve when they created this system of states? They created artificial weak states. These are artificial creations. The names are not artificial and are not new. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, these are all names with long histories, but not in these borders. The borders of Iraq, the borders of Syria, the borders of Lebanon, the borders of Palestine were established by the British and the French according to imperial interests. What do we mean by imperial interests? For instance, once oil was discovered in Mesopotamia, which became Iraq, in northern Iraq, and the British Navy moved to oil instead of coal on the eve of World War I. At the end of the war, the British wanted northern Iraq in their hands and wanted control of territory, contiguous territory, from northern Iraq to the Mediterranean in order to lay a pipeline to take the oil from northern Iraq to the Mediterranean. This is how borders were established. This is also why northern Iraq, inhabited by Kurds, was added to the south and center of Iraq. What was the result? A country that had 60% Shia Arabs, 20% Sunni Arabs, and 20% Kurds who are not Arabs but are Sunni. Now, go and make a functioning state out of all of this. Syria. So France always had historic ties to the Levant, very much wanted the Levant as its spoil at the end of World War I. And it divided it into two states, Syria and Lebanon, and it added territories from Syria into Lebanon, because Lebanon was at that time dominated by Catholics and very pro-French. They wanted to weaken Syria and to empower Lebanon. The result was very artificial boundaries. Jordan, the country created by Winston Churchill. Asher Sasser is the world's expert on the history of Jordan. Prince Abdallah of the Hashemite family was very unhappy with what the British and the French were doing, took his Bedouin soldiers and began to march from the Arabian Peninsula towards Damascus. The British stopped him right there in Jordan and said, you know, stop here, we'll give you your own state, and they gave him an emirate called the Emirate of Transjordan, which eventually became Jordan, which of all the artificial creations in that part of the world proved to be the most resilient. But that's a different story. So these states were created, first of all, on artificial basis. Second, there was a myth. The myth was that everybody was an Arab. Everybody who spoke Arabic was an Arab. And the dominant ideology was Arab nationalism, so presumably these were all Arab states. But this was misleading, because Arab nationalism was Sunni Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism has always been dominated by the Sunni political elite. So that in countries like Syria and Iraq, the minorities, the Shia in Iraq, or the Alawites, the Druze, the Ismailis, and all the Christians, the Kurds, all these other minorities, never felt real partners in these countries. In theory, what should have been done was a construction of a pluralistic political system that would divide or distribute political power among the communities. The only place where this was done successfully for many years was Lebanon, where power has been divided on a demographic basis between the different communities, and this is why Lebanon, until the civil war of 1975, was the only functioning parliamentary democracy in the Arab world. But in other countries like Iraq, Syria, and so forth, the pretense that everybody was an Arab and everybody was an equal partner in the state was kept for centuries, until, with the events of the past few years, all the masks were torn and reality came to the surface, and it turned out that everybody was not an Arab, everybody was not his neighbor's brother, everybody was a member of an ethnic, sectarian community, and the fabric of these states and societies went to pieces. This is what we mean when we speak today about the Arab turmoil. At the end of 2010, in early 2011, people very hopefully spoke about the Arab Spring. After the revolution in Tunisia, in Egypt, and it spread to other places, there was hope that maybe the Arab world was finally, after decades of disquiet and instability, coming to peace with itself into a better period. That was called the Arab Spring. It didn't take long, as we know, for the Arab Spring to turn into an Arab winter. And the most significant place where the transition from spring to winter occurred was Syria. In March 2011, the Arab Spring arrived in Syria, and in southern Syria, in a town called Deraa, quiet demonstrations took place against the regime, asking for reforms and asking for economic benefits, because there has been drought in southern Syria for a number of years. People were suffering, and they wanted the government to look after them. And Bashar al-Assad, and here we come to the weaknesses and shortcomings of the present ruler of Syria, instead of responding, instead of talking to demonstrators, began to quash them. And quashing led to further demonstrations, and further demonstrations developed into a rebellion, and the rebellion developed into a civil war, and the civil war developed into a regional an international crisis. So here we come to another important point, the transition into a regional crisis. What happened to Syria is that Syria became the Spain of this decade. The Spain, I mean the Spain of the 1930s. The Spanish Civil War was the arena in which the prelude to World War II was conducted brutally during the Spanish Civil War, where the Soviet Union on one hand and Nazi Germany on the other were contending with one another at the expense of the Spanish people. And something similar, mutatis mutandis, has happened in Syria, where the two important regional players, primarily Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other, are fighting it out. Iran, the Shia country, supports the regime and President Assad, and Saudi Arabia and its partners support the opposition, the Sunni majority, the Islamists, against the Alawites that are supported by Iran. Now, of course, Saudi Arabia and Iran are not alone in the game. Almost every other regional actor has a finger in the pie. Turkey, Jordan, Qatar, and so forth. I didn't mention one regional actor, and I'll come to that missing actor in a couple of minutes. So, everybody has his own pet actor in this civil war. Iran supports the regime. In fact, the regime has lost the ability to fight. The Syrian army, to all intents and purposes, doesn't exist anymore. The fighting is done, first and foremost, by a Shiite militia in Lebanon, Hezbollah, at the behest of their Iranian patrons, by Iranian volunteers, by Iraqi volunteers, not by the Syrian army. And these are the people who fight on behalf of the regime, and of course, more recently, by Russia, but we'll come to that. The opposition, there's not one opposition, there are dozens of opposition groups, has a secular component. You should take the term secular with a grain of salt. A secular moderate element that is supported by the United States, by Britain, by France, other Western countries, and by some of the regional countries. Their military element is called the Free Syrian Army. But most of the fighting, most of the effective fighting is done by Islamist groups. Some of them more radical, some of them more moderate. This is where the Islamic State has made its reputation, because it fought with great effect in the Syrian civil war. There are other groups affiliated with al-Qaeda, there are groups that are supported by Saudi Arabia, and so forth and so forth. And this indeed is one of the weaknesses of the Syrian opposition. It's not one entity, many entities. Second weakness of the Syrian opposition is that it's not known to anyone. I could ask you here, and I could do it practically with any audience that I'd be speaking to, give me 3 names of leaders of the Syrian opposition. Dead silence. You never heard about them, you never saw them on television, they have not been received in the White House, and so forth and so forth. So this is a weakness of the Syrian opposition. Yet, it has been able to keep the regime to a draw. The regime has the Air Force, the regime had the Armored Corps, and the opposition has fought effectively despite these divisions and the absence of sophisticated weapon systems, to the point where a few weeks ago it seemed that they were close to defeating the regime, which led Russia to decide to intervene, led Russia or Vladimir Putin to intervene in the civil war and send his airplanes or missiles to fight on behalf of the regime, because it seemed for a few days that the opposition was penetrating the hardcore of the territory controlled by the regime. I should say something about numbers at this point. The regime controls about 30% of Syria. 70% is controlled by the opposition. But 60% of the remaining population is in regime-controlled area because these areas, ironically, are considered safer by people. Of the 22 million inhabitants of Syria, almost 10 million are refugees. 4 million outside Syria, 6 million are displaced inside Syria, and as I said before, almost 300,000 people have been killed in this civil war. It's a terrible human tragedy. Of course, it's a very important regional issue because I described the map of rivalries. And think about Syria's location. Syria is centrally located. It borders on several countries. It borders on Turkey, on Iraq, on Jordan, on Lebanon, and on Israel. It has 5 neighbors. And controlling Syria is very important strategically for anyone who is interested in hegemony or in influence in the Middle East. Now let me say something about the missing actor, Israel. I mentioned all the others. What about Israel? Well, miraculously, I would say, or not miraculously, of all of Syria's neighbors, Israel has been the least involved and the least affected thus far. This is quite surprising, given the fact that for many years Syria was our foremost enemy, and that for more than 20 years we have been negotiating with Syria on and off. It's been mentioned I was a negotiator for almost 4 years in the 90s. There have been other negotiations, and let me surprise you with one of them. Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu negotiated with Assad twice. He negotiated with the father in his first term as prime minister. He used an American businessman, a cosmetics magnate, Ronald Lauder, as his emissary, and negotiated with the father. And he's negotiated through an American diplomat, Fred Hoff, with the son to the very eve of the outbreak of the civil war. So we have had an on and off negotiation with Syria for almost 20 years. We have had a bitter rivalry with Syria since the first days of the Israeli statehood. And of course, it's very important for Israel to know and to be perhaps involved in the question of what happens across our northern border. But we are not involved. We are not involved, I think rightly so, because we could not be constructively involved. First there was a question of whose side are we on? And there was an interesting debate in Israel between 2 schools of thought. One is known as the devil you know, or the devil we know, Assad. Why the term devil we know? The term the devil we know was coined by Prime Minister Sharon in 2005. When Prime Minister Sharon came to see President George W. Bush in 2005, Bush, who hated Bashar al-Assad because of Assad's help to the Iraqi insurrection, said to Sharon, let's get rid of him. And Sharon said to him in the Oval Office, Sharon said to him, he is the devil we know. In other words, we know he's the devil, but we know him, we know how to get along with him, and we know that the alternative is Islamist. So, from my point of view, said Ariel Sharon, in fact, I prefer to stay with the devil I know. And so once the civil war broke out, not Sharon, but other Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu in this case, had to ask himself the same question. Do I want Assad to remain in power? Or maybe do I want the opposition to win, but if the opposition wins, it may very well be the Islamist opposition. Do I want the Islamists or the jihadis to be in power in Syria? So it's been difficult for Israel to decide, A, whether it wants to be involved, and secondly, on whose side it wants to be. Personally, I never had a doubt that I never bought the devil we know theory, because for me the axis, Tehran, Damascus, Hezbollah, and now of course Moscow, Tehran, Damascus, Hezbollah, is more dangerous than the Islamists for Israel. Second, if Israel was to help the opposition, it would actually have been playing into Assad's hands, because Assad has always said this is not a genuine rebellion, this is a conspiracy hatched from the outside. If it were to be discovered that Israel was helping the opposition, he would be vindicated. So we've decided to stay put on the sidelines. We offer humanitarian help, and we drew red lines. Red lines are: we will not tolerate for Hezbollah to establish itself on the other side of the Golan Heights and to extend the confrontation line from the Mediterranean across the Lebanese border into the Golan Heights. And secondly, we will not tolerate the regime providing sophisticated weapon systems to Hezbollah, because Syria has been given by the Soviets, by the Russians, very sophisticated weapon systems. Let me mention one. It's called Yachont. It's a shore-to-sea missile with a range of about 160 miles. You know that by now we have gas, we have the drilling rigs, and they can be hit by a Yachont missile from the Lebanese shore. This is not something we want to see in the hands of Hezbollah. So we have announced and we have executed that whenever we discovered that a convoy carrying sophisticated weapons was on its way from Syria to Lebanon, we interdicted it from the air. We did that at least 8 or 10 times during the last few years. But we are not intervening in the Syrian civil war. So here is this paradoxical situation that Israel, with important interest in Syria, with the strongest army in the neighborhood, could have decided this civil war and decided to stay out of it. I would say decided wisely to stay out of it. But this is something that could change very, very rapidly. In a matter of moments and days, changes could take place in Syria that would draw Israel deeply in. Let me talk about now the international dimension. I spoke about the regional dimension. The regional dimension is, of course, first and foremost the new Cold War, the American-Russian rivalry in the Middle East. So the United States also made the decision not to become involved in the Syrian civil war. A conscious decision by President Obama, contrary to the advice he was given by his most senior aides. In 2012, the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Secretary of Defense Bill Gates, Leon Panetta, General Petraeus, 4 major figures, and the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all these senior officers recommended that the United States begin to support the relatively secular moderate opposition before it became too late. And the President, upon the advice of his intimate circle of advisors, who are not necessarily foreign policy experts, decided not to do that. This is the Iraq and Afghanistan trauma. And after the unsuccessful wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, he has been determined not to be drawn into a third Middle Eastern war. No boots on the ground, as the cliche says, or as Colin Powell said, if you break it, you own it. Oh, President Obama has been consistent in his determination to remain out. So this has created a vacuum. If you have no superpower supervision, a vacuum is created, and into that vacuum decided to walk Vladimir Putin. For one reason was to save the regime when it seemed a few weeks ago to be on the verge of collapse. Russia has a naval base on the Syrian coast and wants to have it. And he saw low-hanging fruit. If the United States is passive, and this goes on without an end in sight, this is a golden opportunity for Russia to become the premier actor in this crisis and to vindicate Russia as a great power again after the humiliation of the Boris Yeltsin years. So the Russians began to intervene with the Air Force, with missiles. I remember the show Russian missiles are being fired from the Caspian Sea into Syria, and Russian jets are bombing, blah, 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 blah. The bottom line is not so good from Russia's point of view, because the Islamic State took revenge and blew up a Russian jetliner over the Sinai. Results on the ground are not that great. The Russians are not deciding the war, because these wars cannot be decided from the air. There was a clash with Turkey. I think Turkey seems to be more frightened than Russia, but it's not good for either. So at this point, Russian intervention has not produced dramatic positive results, but it's there, which is one of the reasons that Israel has to be worried, because we now have Russia as a neighbor. The Russian Air Force in Syria is not good news for Israel. So we have successfully delineated lines and areas with the Russians, but this, as we saw in the Turkish case, could easily unravel, and this is not good news for us or for the Turks or for most actors in the picture. So the Russians say that they can produce a political settlement. Can a political settlement be produced? Maybe. Because the key question is going to be, what about Bashar al-Assad? The Iranians will not give him up. They will not give him up because Iran's most successful exploit in its foreign policy of the Islamic Republic is Lebanon. The fact that their proxy, Hezbollah, is de facto in control of Lebanon. They have a base on the Mediterranean, and Iran, you have to remember, thinks in imperial terms. Iran does not think of itself as yet another Middle Eastern country. It's a country with 80 million people, with a very sophisticated elite. We know the kind of nuclear ambitions they had and have, a civil society, and an imperial tradition. It is the successor state for the Persian empires. And so it wants to be a hegemonial Middle Eastern power. Lebanon is their greatest success, and Syria is the hinterland to the success in Lebanon. If Bashar al-Assad goes, Hezbollah may go. They will go to great lengths to protect their investment in Lebanon and in Syria. But if Assad is to stay, the opposition will not agree, and the West will not agree. How do you overcome this? How do you square the circle in this regard is a very difficult question. And even if you come to an agreement on paper, on some transitional arrangement, is it going to work? In the long range, I think that in both Iraq and Syria, the solution has to be a federal structure. If these two countries are ever going to be put together again, there have to be very loose federations in which the regions, the communities will all have a great deal of autonomy, because they cannot be centralized unitary states again for a very, very long time. But these federal solutions are not around the corner. It will take years to negotiate them and to make them work. The kind of intervention and solution that you provided in the Balkans in the 1990s will not happen in Syria, because the United States is not playing the role that it was ready to play in the Balkans in the 1990s. So, at the risk of making a prediction, I would say at the end of the tunnel there are solutions, but it is a tunnel, and it will take a long time before we get through that tunnel, and Syria may remain a problem. As it remains a problem, it affects the whole region. Lebanon is not a very stable country itself, had to take almost 1 million Syrian refugees. Jordan, almost 1 million. Turkey became sick and tired of the very large number of refugees and began to send them to Europe. And suddenly Europe is facing two huge interrelated issues: refugees and terrorists. and the two, as we know, are interconnected. So the Syrian issue does not remain contained in Syria or in the Levant. It has reached the coast of Europe a long time ago, and as we saw just a couple of days ago, it has also gone as far west as California in a way. So it's not something that the world can afford to ignore or to look the other way. The world needs to look after the problem, and what we need to see is American leadership. Now, this may not be coming in an election year, with 1 year left for President Obama, who is determined not to be drawn in. So we may have to struggle through the next year, and it may have to wait for a new American president with a different outlook on this issue for America to take the role that only America can play, to put Putin back in place as an important power, but not the superpower that the Soviet Union used to be, and for America to reassume the role that only America can play. Thank you very much.